Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. Today's episode, I kind of wanted to continue on a topic that I discussed in an episode a few weeks back about the unwanted horse problem. And I kind of wanted to go at it from a slightly different angle to just talk about how the horse industry is kind of conditioned us to have this like disposable outlook on horses and what I think contributes to that mindset being created and also why it's so problematic. And like this is one of the topics that like when I bring it up, it oftentimes inevitably will result in upsetting people and having them feel very personally attacked. And it's one of those things where I think that when we have these discussions, if it creates like a visceral emotional response and something that in someone, that's something that needs to be looked at, and we need to be exploring why. Because a lot of these topics that I discuss on this podcast, this one included, there are things that if you had approached me with these same topics several years ago, I too would have felt attacked and I would have had a very emotional, visceral response to them. And I would have gotten very defensive because the topics would have brought out a certain level of discomfort in me by exposing some mindsets that I held that I didn't really want to like unpack what they said at face value. And I think that's the thing is we do need to look deeper at like what our actions are saying about what we hold to a greater importance when it comes to caring for our horses. And that's kind of what I want to do with like a lot of these podcast episodes is discuss topics that I feel like people just need to maybe look at from like a different angle, because it isn't to say that I think most horse people in this industry do not love horses, because I think ultimately for the vast majority of people in this industry, that's initially what draws us in. But there is like a very unconscious conditioning process that happens as you enter the horse world, as you take lessons, particularly if you get into the horse world from like a competitive standpoint. There's a conditioning process that occurs that starts to shift your mindset in ways without you even realizing, and you start to normalize things that if you look a little deeper at what they say about your priorities and how you approach working with horses and how you view horses, if you look at them more deeply, they expose some things that a lot of people don't actually want to have associated with their relationship with horses. But denying what our actions actually say about us and how we approach horses doesn't change what those actions are actually saying. And that's why it's important to look deeper and also like look at our triggers and why we respond to things in a certain way. So I wanted to talk a bit more about that and also just like the disposable nature of horses in general and why it's so problematic, because I do think that a lot of the people who defend the actions that I would refer to as disposable, they're doing so from a self-protective standpoint rather than actually trying to look at it through the horse's perspective and what is most fair to the horses as animals, because they want to be able to make certain decisions and do things without thinking about what those actions are doing to the horse and what they say as the greater picture of things and what norms they are perpetuating in this industry that are not okay. So that's kind of a long-winded intro to kind of tease what we're going to be talking about. But this might be a triggering topic for some people. And honestly, like for anything on this podcast, if something I say triggers an emotional response in you, you don't have to agree with what I'm saying at all. You can vehemently disagree. You can say that I'm wrong. But if you feel like you get an emotional trigger, regardless of how you choose to feel about me after, I encourage you to sit with that and try to figure out where that's coming from, because it can be very valuable information when we're emotionally triggered by something. And this is something that I've been trying to become more and more conscious of over the years, especially with being online and being like a quote unquote public figure in the horse world. There have been lots of things over the years that have triggered me, like people making comments and like especially before I started to make a lot of these major shifts, like when people would make any criticism or comment about like horsemanship, like when Milo was really stressed and they would point out his behavior, that stuff would be really triggering to me and it would trigger a very defensive and emotional response, which was exposing something that I should have looked deeper into at the time, because if I truly felt confident in the way that I was doing things, it wouldn't have created such an emotional trigger. And this isn't to say that if you possess like a high level of confidence and certainty that you're doing the right things for your horses, that you're never going to be offended or triggered by people saying things that feel offensive. It's just like the degree to which it triggers you, how visceral that trigger is, how defensive you are, and how much you're trying to like prove to them that you're not wrong. Because ultimately, if you feel like you're doing the right thing, if someone else doesn't think that you are, it shouldn't really bother you that much because they're entitled to feel that way. Like how people feel about you as a person isn't necessarily a statement on who you are as a person. It's more of a statement on the lens through which they are viewing you. And especially if they're not people close to you in your personal life, this lens is even more obscured because they're looking at you through the lens of the not only like the persona that you're putting out online. And no matter how accurately you try to portray yourself online, it's never going to capture the full essence of who you are as a person because it's very two-dimensional. So people making those types of judgments are not close to you. They don't know you well, and you shouldn't let it get to you to the same point as if someone close to you made like a valid criticism from a place where they know you and know a lot more about you. Because ultimately, like no matter how honestly you try to portray your life online, people don't know you. And I try to like be very transparent and honest and raw with how I share things online because I think that we need more of that. I think we need more authenticity. I think we need more vulnerability. And like even when people are doing things within the lens of like it being a business thing or you're being an influencer or you're like a social icon or whatever you want to call it, right? Whatever you want to refer to these things to, even when you're in that space and like even when it's like literally just for like a specific business, like not even like where it's your likeness that is being your brand, like where you're actually selling things, I do still think there's a duty to like possess humanity and normalize the idea that there's a person behind the screen, even for businesses, and also to stand up for stuff that you believe in and that's important and stand up against injustice. I really don't buy into the mindset that just because you're a public figure, a celebrity, or a business, or an influencer, or whatever, that you shouldn't be able to speak out on important issues. And I think that that is kind of part of not the same thing, but the conditioning processes that I'm referencing, where we're conditioning people to feel like it is unprofessional to take a stand against things and to have an opinion on what is right and wrong and to speak that into existence and to stand up against injustices in the world. Because for whatever reason, there's this mindset that once you become well known, you should just remain impartial and apathetic and that you shouldn't do anything that could be remotely controversial. But life is controversial. If we're ultimately trying to change things for the better in any industry, in any part of the world, we do need to speak out and share things. And I think that the very essence where we have these people who have more power because they have a greater following than the average person, that those very people are being encouraged to not speak out, I think that's a huge issue. And businesses too. Like, honestly, I am more attracted to businesses who actually stand up for what they believe in and are outspoken on social issues that are important. And I like that. I don't have an issue with businesses getting, I'm doing air quotes right now, political, because if their version of being political is advocating for people who are voiceless or marginalized or advocating for important things that are at their core about like promoting humanity, kindness, ethics, etc., like that's the type of company that I want to support. And I know a lot of people don't stand for that, but I'm very much of the mind that like we need to shift that mindset where it should be viewed as weirder to make the choice to not stand against anything just so you can sell more stuff. Like, I think that that is so predatory and insidious and gross, because if you're caring more about marketing yourself to the point where you're profiting more than you do about being a good person and standing by your morals, then that's just like icky and it's very inauthentic. So I think more people and businesses need to embrace taking whatever loss they might incur by standing by their morals and promoting the ethics that they believe in, because the people that you're losing out on aren't people that actually like or support you for who you are anyways. And like, I mean, I've lost a lot of support from certain types of people depending on what I post. Like, I shared something about, it was like a text post where I said the problem with trying to use like morality and like compassion to reason with people for change is that like if they possess none, this can't be. This is like such a less eloquent way of putting it than I wrote it, because I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically you can't use ethics and like morality and compassion to reason with people who don't possess those qualities, because it's not going to work. They won't be reasoned with those because it doesn't appeal to them. And this was like right following the election results, and despite not saying who I was talking about, like so many people assumed that it was only directed at one specific, very orange, belligerent male politician. And honestly, it was applicable to, I would argue, most politicians, because again, this is like what I was saying about public figures, where they're putting on a persona and they're like just trying to pander to people without actually taking any real hard stance on things. And they're like, or if they do take hard stances on things, they're picking things that are safe. And same goes for celebrities. Like, I am a fan of Taylor Swift's music, for example, but I think that she only speaks on like controversy, and I'm going to use that very loosely, when it's something that is going to be most accepted by her following. So for example, embracing like feminism and talking about misogyny and stuff, like that's a safer form of controversy to engage in, because most of her fans are not men. But she's not going to speak out on bigger problems in the world that she could make a huge difference on if she did, because it would be too controversial. But anyways, I'm going off track and like way out of left field right now. So we're going to jump back into the topic at hand, which is just talking about the horse industry and some of the corruption, the disposable nature, and that societal conditioning. But the reason why I kind of went off key there to talk about these different things is that I think that the structure of like how the world functions as a whole, and all of these different pieces of conditioning and like what we've chosen to normalize and what we've chosen to try to make taboo, all of this stuff feeds into the horse industry, into every other industry, and it creates existing biases that are then more easily passed down in highly specific ways in those specific industries. So with horses, some of the stuff that we see, like obviously it'll be highly specific to horses, but even with the disposable nature of horses, in my perspective, that comes from a very capitalistic mindset where we're separating ourselves from what our actions are actually saying about us and what they say about the greater picture of what we support. So there's people who will want to perpetuate the idea, like outside of the horse world, like I love everyone, I support everyone, I just want the world to be a peaceful, happier place. But their actions and how they are pretending they're going about doing that are just being apathetic, not speaking out against the power structures that are harming people. And they view not causing a ruckus in any capacity as the path to peace, when in actuality, when you have corruption and unfairness in the world, you can't really achieve peace without rocking the boat first, because you're trying to shake loose these power structures that are causing people harm. And if you're apathetic and you don't have a voice against those things, and you just try to lay low and not rock the boat or create any controversy, the people in power who are harming other people are actually enabled in doing so. So while you're not like actively fighting anyone, you're still contributing to a very harmful mindset by not saying anything. And we see this disconnect from like our actions and what they actually say about our ethics, or at least our willingness to stand by and put into action our ethics and put into practice our ethics. We want to disconnect from that because people don't want to actually take accountability for what their lack of action says about them and how it's impacting the horses that they claim to love. So what I wanted to talk about is kind of like, and I've done this in a couple of other episodes, but this is going to be from a different lens. So it's like the nature of like buying and selling horses and how horses are viewed as a whole and how problematic some of that can be. And this isn't to say that I'm against selling horses, and I always want to stress this because I feel like oftentimes when I talk about difficult topics, people who do get that immediate emotional trigger run with it and they take what I say massively out of context. So the act of selling horses in general does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. It's just what it has become in the horse industry that is the problem. So for example, we've created this mindset that like horses are very disposable. So when you like outgrow your horse, you pass them down. Or if that horse becomes injured and you can no longer ride them at all, or at the very least cannot compete them at the level that you would have liked to, people feel more justified and emboldened in rehoming them. It's less of a problem if the horse is still sound for something and like someone else can use them than it is if they're completely permanently lame and cannot be ridden, but it's still kind of the same thing. And the problem with this is that a lot of people will want to do this through the lens of like, I love this horse to death. They're the love of my life. But like, I need a horse that I can ride. And it can be true that you love that horse, but in essence, making the decision to rehome a lame horse and essentially pass the problem on to someone else is choosing riding over your love for that horse. Because if the love for the horse was actually truly what was in the driver's seat and what was being held at the forefront, you wouldn't no longer want to have that horse in your life simply because you cannot ride them. And this is the type of actions that we're seeing so many riders doing. And it's particularly common in competitive riding where people are showing and whatnot, because it's very normalized by trainers to do this, where you kind of like, if your horse is no longer sound to compete at the level you want or no longer sound to ride at all, they want you to get something that you can continue riding and stay in lessons with. And for a lot of people, this often involves getting rid of the horse that they had because they cannot afford 2 horses, or they cannot afford to have that horse and lease one. And we have to look at like the core of these actions. If you're choosing to put a horse who is now injured in a way where they are less desirable than they were when they were at full capacity, if you're choosing to put them in a situation where you're essentially playing Russian roulette with where they go, just so that you can continue riding and competing, it does speak for where your priorities are. Because if your priorities were with that love for the horse and the relationship that you've built for them, as much as it would suck and it would still be a grieving process to give up riding them, because that would be a disappointment and that's totally valid. If the love was what was centered and first, you would keep that horse even despite not being able to ride them. And this is the issue that we're seeing on such a massive scale, especially throughout the winter months, but also like all throughout show season. You'll see people trying to give away horses for free to good home after they've gotten a career-ending injury, and they're like, oh, they're no longer sound for riding. I love this horse to death. No fault of their own, but like I need a horse that I can ride, so now this one's available. And I said this before in like my podcast on like a good death and like humane euthanasia, not pawning horses off onto other people. But if a rider has had a horse for any length of time where they've been riding and competing that horse and they've gotten to know the horse well, and they're like, they have built what they should have built, a relationship with that horse, and they still don't want to keep that horse into their retirement, you have to ask yourself why someone else who's never even met that horse, who's never built that relationship with that horse, would want that horse, especially when there's so many horses who are completely sound that do need homes. Why would someone go out of their way to get a horse who is damaged and has physical health problems and cannot be ridden or worked to the same capacity that they would have before? Why would a stranger want to take on the burden of caring for that horse if the person who's built that relationship with them for years doesn't even want to do that themselves? And that's something to look at. And again, like I've had this mindset before where I've very much bought into the idea where it's like I was prioritizing competing and showing, and like if my horses weren't usable for that, then they would be rehomed. And like the most notable occurrence I have for this is like with one of my old horses, Dallas. And I don't regret the decision that I made in this setting, because where I was at in my headspace at that time, I wasn't the best home for him, and he's still in the home that I sold him to. And he was also not like career ending unsound. He actually still is sound for riding, but they've just retired him because his owners haven't been riding. So he's just like a companion horse and a pet. But like what I will say about that situation too is when that happened, I was put like at a crossroads where like, because he was such an easygoing, easy to handle horse, like the first 2 people who came to see him wanted him. And the first set of people was like a family who wanted like a family riding horse and had a farm, and they were going to pay like the full rehoming price that I had for him, which was only like $1,200. So it wasn't very much. And they wanted to come get him right away. But like, I just felt something like just off about that. And then the other people were people that had come down here to look at some rescue horses at a rehoming facility, but none of them were really suitable for the setup that they had, where they like had the horses out on grass full time and whatnot. So then they came to look at Dallas. They're like, okay, like our budget is $400, which is like obviously like a third of what the other people offered me, but I got way, way better vibes from them. So I took that at a loss and just like like, and it already was at a loss anyways, but it was like, okay, I could have had $800 more, which to me when I was 18 was like a lot of money. And I didn't take it because I felt way better about the home, and it was like still to this day one of the best decisions that I ever made. However, despite how much I freaking loved that horse, at the time I was prioritizing riding above having him in my life because I wanted to ride to the point where I was willing to rehome him and deal with the heartbreak of not having him in my life anymore so that I could keep riding. And it led me to some really great lessons that I learned, like obviously getting Milo and like all of that stuff that was really beneficial to my growth as a human overall. But in that moment, there's no way around the fact that the actions of what I was doing were prioritizing my desire to ride and compete above having that horse in my life. So no matter how much I loved him, there's still, you have to look at where the priorities are being pointed. So in my humane euthanasia episode, I talked about how, like, if a horse becomes career-ending lame and they can no longer be ridden, rather than giving them away to free to good home, if you're not willing to keep them, like, you do owe them a good death. And like the reason why I think a lot of people don't want to do this is because it really puts into perspective your priorities in a very, very finalized way. Whereas if you pawn them off onto someone else, you can kind of gaslight yourself into thinking that that is the best decision long-term and they will be fine, despite how many horses end up falling through the cracks and absolutely are not fine and end up getting lost along the way. And especially when they're young, when they get these career-ending injuries, they have many, many years left to live. Like, a lot of horses do not stay in the same homes for their whole life. They go through several homes, even when they are completely sound. So when you're selling a horse who's not rideable or who has like significant physical health problems, they would probably be one of the first horses to go in the event that the person you sell them to can no longer afford that many horses or can no longer afford to have a horse at all. So when we're in a position where we no longer want to keep a horse because they're not rideable or aren't rideable at a high enough level to what we want, where they're like, and like, this isn't even just saying like, oh, like this is a 20-year-old horse who needs to go from jumping like 3'6" to just doing cross rails, but it's still completely sound walk, track, canter for flat work, trails, whatever. It's like the horse that's like, oh, this horse is basically only sound for like lead line, like walk, trot, very, very minimum light riding, and has like significant health problems or is completely lame. And if we won't keep them through that and they're at high risk and they're way less desirable because of those injuries, then there's a decision that needs to be made. Like, particularly if they're completely unsound for riding and you're trying to rehome them as a companion horse, because that is especially problematic. But the reason why most people want to do the rehoming instead of doing humane euthanasia is because when you decide to euthanize a horse so that you can go get a rideable horse, it really puts into perspective where your priorities lie, because you're taking a horse that you could have in theory paid to retire and just keep alive and they would have been pasture sound and fine, and you're choosing to euthanize them so that you can get another rideable horse. And it really starkly puts into perspective where your priorities are in a way that is like much harder to look at and sit with than just like rehoming them. Because if you give them to a home, even if you never hear from them again, or even if you only check in for like the first few months or year, and then like the horse is living for like presumably another like 10, 20 plus years, and you don't know where they've gone after that, like you can still kind of trick yourself into thinking that they're fine, even if they're not. Whereas if you euthanize them, it's very finalized and you're making a very clear decision where you're like, okay, I'd rather euthanize this horse than retire them. And it's harder for people to sit with. However, it's kinder for the horse in a lot of cases because you're not putting them up in, like, you're not putting their future up for a gamble. You're not putting them into a situation where they are a far less desirable horse and where they're more likely to fall through the cracks because they're harder to rehome. And it's not even necessarily like they fall through the cracks and they get shipped to slaughter. It could be like people drug them and continue riding them and using them for lessons to their own detriment. But the fact of the matter is, when a horse is not rideable, they become disposable enough that they are going to be like some of the first horses to end up in bad situations. And like the other thing too is like, if we want to shift this disposable mindset pertaining to horses and make it so that unrideable horses are not so disposable and are not so unwanted, that starts with people not viewing them as disposable and not just wanting to give them away and pawn them off onto other people when they become unrideable. And that needs to start with people shifting their headspace to look at like, okay, if I really love this horse and I'm in this for horses, why are all of my decisions centering riding above the well-being of this specific horse? And if you're uncomfortable with the idea of giving your horse like a humane euthanasia when they're career-ending lame and you do not want to retire them, you should be just as, if not more, uncomfortable with putting their future in the hands of a stranger. And in the really uncommon circumstances that you have people in your life that are willing to take on that horse and take care of them, and they're like, you've vetted them and whatever, it's like, okay, sure. But like, the reason why I talk about these things is like, that is not the rule. That is the exception. A lot of people don't have that, and they're just putting their horses up on Facebook groups to rehome them like that. Like, for the people who have connections that would actually properly retire the horse and are well known to them, usually those horses you never actually see for sale because it's just like privately dealt with between people that already know each other well. The other thing to note too is that there's a lot of facilities that you can send horses to retire at that are substantially cheaper than what it would be to board a horse at a show barn. And you could send them away where you're not having to care for them, but you're still keeping them alive and keeping them in a safe place, and where you're still their owner, so that like if anything happens, like you ultimately get to have the final say on where they go and you're still protecting them. And that's also an option. Where I live, boarding's very expensive, but a lot of people send their horses further away where there's way more available land and you can retire them out there. Of course, with that, you also run the risk of, if they're far away and you cannot check on them frequently, there are sketchy boarding facilities that don't feed the horses enough or aren't caring for them properly, and you're not necessarily always around to check on that, which is why it's important to like vet the facilities that you board at, or to ideally like find somewhere that's at least close enough to some people you know that they could pop in every now and then. So there's a little bit more accountability, but that's also an option. It's not necessarily between giving them away or euthanizing them, because you can find cheaper board. And while it would still mean that you have the expenses of more than one horse, it's, again, still a better solution when you're trying to secure the future for the horse. But basically all I'm getting at is that horses are never going to stop being disposable when they're not rideable, unless we shift the mindset of the riders and have them be more happy to have horses whether they're rideable or not, and start to shift the mindset to have the level of accountability that most people hold dog owners to. Like, people with dogs are held hyper accountable to the point where I have literally seen people getting bashed when they are like evicted, or they can't afford rent and they're desperately trying to find a place that they can have a pet at. They cannot successfully find a place where they can bring their dog, and they're like absolutely frantic, like so upset, posting in rehoming groups, talking about the situation, how much they love their dog, how desperately they do not want to give the dog away, but that they're in a situation where they feel they have no choice and they need to find somewhere to live, and they don't have any options in terms of people close to them that are able to take the dog. And I've still seen people in those situations get shamed by people and be like, you shouldn't get a dog unless you can protect their future. Even in those situations, it's a lot more justifiable. I'm personally of the mind, from like a rental perspective, that I don't think landlords should be able to deny pets. Like, I think it should be the same thing as if you're bringing children into the house. Children can be really damaging and they can do a lot of damage to a house, just like pets can. But you can't say no children in most cases unless it's like a seniors community. And I think that if we shifted the rules for tenancy agreements, it would protect a lot more animals, and we wouldn't see animals getting rehomed to the extent that they currently are. It still wouldn't be great, and there'd still be way too many people getting animals that they don't intend to keep for life and then pawning them off onto other people, but it would be less of a problem. But with that said, like, if someone had an elderly dog and then they're like, I don't feel like caring for this dog anymore, I'm going to send this dog to the shelter and then get a puppy, like, you would get so attacked by so many people. Like, you'd be hard pressed to find any person who would agree that that's a fair and just decision and wouldn't think that it makes you look like a bad person. And we need to start shifting the perspective in the horse world to be similar to that. Yes, horses are expensive. Yes, they're more expensive to care for than a dog. Yes, they're higher maintenance than a dog. Yes, there's more things to take into account than a dog, because also, like, I would say there's a steeper learning curve and there's a higher degree of knowledge that is required to properly care for a horse. However, most people are not self-boarding their horses. They're outsourcing that work to other people anyways. But With that said, the costs associated with caring for a horse are the same pretty much whether they're rideable or not. Like oftentimes you're spending more on the rideable horse because you're getting things done to keep them sound and happy for riding, like saddle fittings, new tack, massages, more vet work, more farrier work. And if you're competing them, then you're paying for show fees and whatnot. So usually there's more of an expense associated with a rideable horse than an unrideable one. And yet people will use the expense as a reason why they can't keep an unrideable horse, when really what they're actually saying is, I don't want to pay for a horse who I can't use. And then the relationship between the horse and the person is very transactional, where they only want to pay for a horse that they feel is giving them something in return, when really like pets don't really owe us anything. And like, yes, horses are a more expensive, higher maintenance type of animal, but like it shouldn't really differ all that greatly from the animals that we keep in our houses from the standpoint of like what we owe to them. They don't owe us anything. We've made the choice to get them, and we have the capacity to go on Google, to ask around, and to actually like find out information about what exactly it is that we're getting into and make an educated decision. The horse doesn't have any say in like choosing their home in that way, where they can make an educated decision on the right type of owner and turn down the wrong type of owner. Whereas humans can do that with horses. They can go into it and be a lot more meticulous and careful about what they're getting into. And they go into it with a greater degree of knowledge. Horses don't have that choice. They're just at the mercy of whoever decides to get them. And so like there needs to be more accountability on the part of the person. The fact that they are these large, expensive, high maintenance animals does not change the fact that they are still animals who are sentient beings who deserve safety and kindness, and who shouldn't only be provided with those things when they are providing something in return to the person. Because there are a lot of things you can do with an unrideable horse. And I think that's the other problem, is that we have all of these riders who from early on in their riding careers are having the actual active riding prioritized and having that be like the primary focus of their time spent with horses. They view riding as like the best bonding activity. They're prioritizing doing that in lessons. They're prioritizing learning how to ride the horse and pilot them around an arena instead of learning how to like read the horse's behavior in the field, learn more about how the horse is thinking. What does the horse like? Where do they like being scratched? What are their favorite foods? What are their favorite activities? What type of groundwork do they do? What can you do with them on the ground? What are fun exercises you can do that are not riding? That type of stuff largely isn't prioritized from a young age, because also at lesson barns, like there's this mindset where it's like the kids want to ride. And a lot of parents who are not horsey go into it with that mindset too, where they feel like they're being ripped off if they're paying lesson fees, but their kids are not riding. But really, like the best types of lesson barns are the ones that are going to be stressing all of the types of care and handling of the horse outside of riding, because that is what it is to have a horse. So what we've done in this industry is we've created a culture of people who haven't actually been properly introduced to what it actually is to have a horse in terms of like taking on the care of that animal and taking on the responsibility of that animal and what it's truly like to have them in your life. Sorry, that's my chair. And they're not having that prioritized, but instead they're having all of the riding stuff prioritized, and that being the primary focus of everything from like the start of their riding. So when you have people introduced to horses in that way, they start to lack the capacity to see things in a different way and to really notice all of the things that they're actually missing, and like how it's going to impact how they show up for the horses. And like that's how I was introduced to riding and like horses in general, is like riding was the priority. I thought that riding was the bonding activity, and I was taught to have this mindset like that's how you connect with a horse. When in reality, if you actually truly want to connect with your horses, generally speaking, the best way of doing that is going to be outside of riding. Riding's not the best way to connect with them, to bond with them, to get to know them. And this is why you tend to have people who it's like, if they're boarding their horse and all they're doing is going there to brush them, tack up, and ride, a lot of times the people working at those facilities and handling the horses on the ground, like cleaning their stalls, feeding them, being out in the field with them, a lot of times those workers actually know the horses more and know more about the horse's personality and their normal behavior than the owners do, because they're spending a lot more time with the horse that's not just related to riding, because you're not truly getting to see the real personality of a horse if you're only really spending time with them in a setting where you're pretty much always in control of their behavior. And that's how a lot of people are being introduced to horses. So it's no wonder that they don't really have a means of connecting with and enjoying horses if it's not in the saddle. And that also needs to shift. So it's also on lesson barns to start teaching kids differently. But we also see this problem within lesson barns. Like I've seen year after year, there'll be lesson barns who have ponies who they've had for like years and years and years, in some cases decades. And when they're no longer sound to be part of the lesson string, they're rehoming them as a companion horse. And I think that's especially awful because it's like these ponies have put in time to earn someone money and to hold up their business and to make this trainer's success and ability to stay afloat as a business person possible. And then now in their greatest time of need, after they've put in their time and they've put in the work and they just need like a soft place to land and a nice, safe retirement, they're being pawned off to be someone else's problem when the person who's actually squeezed like every droplet of their use out of them is not willing to do so. And I think that's especially awful. It's not great either way, but I think that there is a duty that like as a lesson barn especially, like they have a standard to set. They're teaching people. They should be showing their kids like this is how things run. We have these horses who teach you how to ride. They're so great. They're so quiet. They take care of you. And then when they're done, they stay out in our fields until they die, and they get the good life. They get to enjoy their retirement years in the place that they've always known. They don't have to leave their friends. They don't have to leave the familiar schedule that they know. They get to be a horse and enjoy the best parts of being a horse in a safe place with people that they've known until they die, because that is what we owe them for what they have given to us and all of the knowledge they've taught these students. But unfortunately, even that is not very common. And it should be the bare minimum. And I really do think that like lesson barns need to be held to a higher standard, because also it's like, yes, I get that it's a business. If you cannot keep a bunch of geriatric lesson horses alive, then at the bare minimum, you owe them a humane euthanasia. Give them a few months or weeks or days or whatever where they're being showered with love and affection from the lesson kids and being fed all of the treats they could possibly imagine, and then give them a good death where they're in a place where they feel comfortable and safe, and you're not pawning them off to potentially go unfed or be worked even more by a new home or be sent to an auction or otherwise fall through the cracks. Because there are so many elderly, like really used up horses where you can tell they've been ridden hard in their lives that end up at auctions and end up shipping to slaughter, or if they're lucky, they'll get bailed out by some kind-hearted person. But it should never even get to the point where someone else has to step in, because also at that point, for them to get shipped to an auction, sit in an auction pen and go through all of that, even if they end up getting rescued, that still sucks for them. And it could have been avoided if the person who actually should have been responsible for that horse took accountability and took the responsibility that they signed up for when they took that horse on. And so this is kind of where I'm at. Like, I'm not in the mindset where it's like, oh, like if you get a horse, you should plan to keep them forever until the day that they die and never sell them. Because if you have a healthy horse who is desirable and who you can rehome and find a good home for them, like all the power to you if you need to rehome them. And yes, horses do live a very long time, so that's not always realistic to have them until the day that they die. But you shouldn't be pawning off horses that are already going to have a hard time finding homes and then going and getting another horse. And if you do that, you should not be able to do that without having to sit with the discomfort of what that actually says about you and your priorities and the way that you feel about horses, because it does expose something. And again, like I say this as someone who had that mindset, and looking back at it, it's like very clear to me. If you actually just look at it at face value, it does illuminate where certain priorities are. And we need to be honest with ourselves about that. There has to be a level of accountability in like our decision making and our actions and how we treat our horses and the decisions that we make for our horses and what it says about us and our priorities. And this also goes far beyond just keeping them when they're unsound or when we can't ride them. It's even like little things like if you're prioritizing being at a competitive show barn and having an indoor arena above your horse getting to go outside for more than 4 hours a day, that does also say something about your priorities and like how important that horse's well-being is to you. And there's this mindset in the horse world that like we are so entitled to having these animals that like us choosing to have them in the setting of whatever we have access to is totally fine and justified, that we should be able to do that without judgment or anyone pointing out how it could harm the horse. that shouldn't exist, because if you choose to get an animal that you cannot properly provide the needs for and you cannot properly care for, the fact that you love the animal doesn't cancel out the fact that the animal is not getting proper care. And again, like, I take it back to dogs because I've used this analogy before, but if someone gets a really high energy, high drive dog breed, and then they just proceed to keep it kenneled for 20 plus hours a day, that wouldn't fly with the vast majority of people. And yet in the horse world, you see masses of people defending exactly that. They get this animal that is a social herd species, and then they confine it to isolation in a very small area for 20 plus hours a day. And they want to do that without people judging them. They want to do that and be able to make excuses for it. And it's like, no matter how many excuses you make, that is not okay. And a lot of the excuses revolve around these horses having disordered behaviors, like, oh, if I turn him out, he runs around and freaks out, or, oh, he hates other horses, he attacks other horses. And it's like, okay, like, those are valid challenges to work through, but the important thing to look at is, like, where are those behaviors coming from? Where are they stemming from? What created those behaviors? And if you go back to the source, for the vast majority of horses, those behaviors are created from improper care, from being deprived of adequate socialization from a very young age and not knowing how to socialize with other horses, from being confined in isolation for a very long time. And then when they're put into a way more stimulating, open environment, it's very stressful and overwhelming for them as a result, especially when you do it all at once and you're not introducing them to it in a way where they can learn how to cope with it in a healthy manner where it is not overwhelming. And that is the fault of people. So we shouldn't be using disordered behaviors that are created by improper care to justify the continued existence of improper care. And the reason why this in particular bothers me so much is that when you see horses having problem behaviors under saddle where they're like refusing a jump, or they're like afraid of something that the rider wants the horse to get over so they can enjoy riding them, people are typically very motivated to do what they can to fix those behaviors so that they can ride the horse and enjoy them in the way that they want to. But then when it's something that only affects the well-being of the horse that the person doesn't have to deal with personally, they're less motivated and they're more inclined to make excuses as if it's this unfixable trait that cannot be addressed at all. And that's not fair. So we do need to, like, as a whole, look at like what our priorities say about us. It doesn't mean that like you can't compete, but if you're prioritizing being at a competition barn where the care for horses is not adequate, and you're doing so to the point of like justifying depriving your horses of some of their most core needs, that is a decision that you're making where you're prioritizing your use of that horse, your desire to compete them, and what you want to do with them above that horse's well-being. And that isn't fair to the horse. So we have to look deeper into it, because like what I notice in the horse world, and I think this is like the biggest problem that overarches into like every single welfare issue we see present in the horse world, is where people are centering their feelings and their own belief systems and their own comfort above the comfort of their horses to such an excessively insane extent that people can't even deal with the slightest amount of discomfort that comes with having to reflect on like not doing things properly or potentially causing harm to an animal that they care about. But then they're putting their horses through excess, sustained, chronic, very acute levels of stress that the horse is having to cope with for sometimes their entire life, and other times for a huge portion of it before they ever see a shift. And it's not fair, because if the person can't even deal with the little bit of discomfort that is being told, hey, like, horses are social herd animals, and there's tons of research that shows how stressful it is for them to be confined into small spaces and isolated from other horses. And this is like a well-proven, well-documented thing that really isn't up for debate, because there's so much information pointing in that direction. And people want to be so comfortable that they don't want to have to look at what information is saying and actually consider how it reflects on their care practices. And it's really selfish, because the fact that we can't handle the discomfort of being met with new information that forces us to reflect with an uncomfortable reality and decide what changes we should make to our horse's lifestyle. The fact that people don't want to reflect on that and deal with the discomfort associated with that, because it does suck. I'm not going to downplay that. It's not fun. But it sucks a lot more to be a social animal that's being made to stare at the four wooden walls of a small box for the vast majority of your life and have very little to do and just be chronically stressed because of that. And like most people, with how oversensitive and babyish they are about what they're willing to handle when it comes to discomfort, they couldn't last like a day in the lives of the horses that they put through those levels of discomfort. Like, just again, speaking from experience, like I would go insane if I had to live for like even just 24 hours, like how I have made my show horses in the past live. And how the horses that I grew up learning how to ride on lived, just being stalled all the time. Like I would go crazy. And like we also need to reflect on, like, for us, like look at like little things, like when you're stuck in a waiting room at like the doctor's office, or you're like standing in line somewhere and you're being made to wait in a situation where you are bored. Most people are pulling out their phone. They'll pull out a book. They have some form of enrichment to keep themselves busy. It's very uncommon that you're actually just standing there with nothing to do, especially in a situation where you cannot leave. And so we have grown up basically being able to seek out instant gratification or like instant coping mechanisms, or knowing that we can leave a situation that makes us uncomfortable and having that be our reality. And like we can't fathom having all that taken away and being in a situation where you cannot leave. You don't know when the end is coming. You don't know when you'll be able to exit the jail cell that you're in, and you have nothing to do that whole time. And this is a reality for a lot of horses. So reflecting on how our actions impact our horses and like the excuses that we make, what we try to deflect from accepting as fact, like how we try to shrug off new information and how we try to just look to whatever makes us more comfortable. Those comfort-seeking methods that humans engage in, we need to look at like what it says about our desire to do better for our horses, and also look at like how often horses are unable to seek comfort in the ways that they need because we prevent them from doing so. And denial can be comfortable for a time for people, but ultimately, like once you see certain information, you're exposed to things. The reason why it's so triggering and emotionally reactive when you get exposed to that information, or when someone comments that on your post, is because there's a part of you that knows there's truth to it and you don't want to accept it. You want to shove it down and you want to ignore it, and you want to go into a cognitive dissonance. And then when people expose that information again, and you can't ignore it so easily, you get triggered and you get angry as a result because it's not as successful to shove it down and ignore it. And ignoring how something impacts your horse does not change the impact to your horse. All it does is make you more comfortable at their expense. So the horse is made to suffer and deal with a certain level of discomfort and lack of ability to engage in natural behavior, just so that their owner can move forward in enjoying the apathy and enjoying the like ignorant nature of going forward and doing what they want without having to reflect on how it's impacting the horse. And the horse is the one that ultimately pays the cost for that, so that the rider can be more comfortable in ignoring what their decisions and what their actions are actually doing to this animal. So as a whole, like for this horse industry to change, people need to hold themselves more accountable, and we have to get more comfortable feeling uncomfortable and moving through that discomfort instead of just pushing it aside and getting mad and lashing out at whatever stimulus makes us become aware of certain things that make us uncomfortable. Because like the horses at their core, like on a massive scale in the industry, are chronically uncomfortable and chronically stressed. At the bare minimum, people owe it to their animals to be a little bit uncomfortable if it means potentially improving the level of care and the standard of care that you can provide for them. We can handle a little bit of discomfort for the greater good of our animals and to improve their care over a long period of time, and to become more understanding, to become more aware of their behavior, and to be able to better provide for them. We can handle the discomfort of moving through that, especially with the current level of discomfort that we expect horses to not only move through and live through chronically, but also stay within that level of discomfort and perform for us regardless. And we feel entitled to that performance, and we feel entitled to them being well behaved and doing what we want despite their inability to live the lives that they need in order to be truly happy and fulfilled. And they largely do it because they're these very adaptive, resilient animals. And we don't really appreciate that enough. The fact that we have these horses who are going and being internationally competitive and doing these high-level athletic feats when they don't even have their basic needs met outside of competition is crazy. And the fact that they can do that and be so successful is something we massively take for granted. And they're doing so well, so chronically stressed and unhappy that they're like, it's taking a toll on their mental and physical health over time. And I'm sure it also contributes to the unsoundness that horses experience, because chronic stress is very expensive on the body and it can create a lot of physical damage too. It's not even just the mental discomfort. Like, holding tension and being stressed all the time is really hard on your body and it wears you down over years. And if that's just the reality of life for that long, it's also very hard, even once you start to have those needs met, to actually let go of that stress, because you're used to being in such a heightened state that even when things start to be met and it's calm, you're still waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're still waiting for the next scary thing to happen, because that's been your reality for a while. Like, I would argue the closest a person will actually get to experiencing what it might be like to be like a horse and be in that heightened state of like just awareness and like seeking out and looking, like watching for threats, would be people who suffer from PTSD, because they're in a heightened state where they are more hyper vigilant and more careful and cautious and more easily frightened even just by sounds. It doesn't even necessarily have to be specific triggers to whatever caused the PTSD. When I was at my most anxious and I was like really struggling with working through all of the trauma that like resulted in like complex PTSD, like CPTSD, I would jump at sounds more readily than my horses did. Like, there would be a loud noise or a sudden thing and I would jump and I would like spook more easily than my horses did. And so looking back at that and like how crappy and exhausting it was being in that heightened emotional state all the time, I can only imagine how hard it is on horses who are having to exist in that frame of mind for years and years to come with no escape. Because I was able to advocate for myself and I was able to seek out ways of learning how to cope for it. And I was able to find community in person and online and start to work through those things that way. But like, horses don't have that option. They're just like stuck within it unless we help them. And in order to truly be there and be the best steward for our horses' welfare, we have to self-reflect and we have to have these difficult inner conversations as well as outward conversations with other people to really look at like what our actions are saying. And the horse industry as a whole views horses in a very disposable nature, and it promotes ignorance, because people don't want to have to accept the realities of what we're doing and what it actually says about our level of commitment to horse welfare. And we don't want to have to actually put the work into doing this big reflection and overhaul of like what it would mean for changing in the horse world. But our lack of desire to do that is going to be the demise of the horse world if we don't do it, because this information is only becoming more and more accessible, and like people outside of the horse world are seeing for what it is at face value way more easily than people who have kind of been indoctrinated within the horse world and had certain things normalized to them. And if we don't make the changes, our hand is going to be forced by way of people pushing for the end of competitive horse sports and like honestly the use of horses in general, even just for pleasure riding. So it's time that we start to self-reflect, because I promise the discomfort of doing that initial self-reflection is going to be an awful lot easier than the discomfort of the chaos that will ensue when like our hands are forced, and like the full extent of like how corrupt and problematic so many aspects of the horse industry gets exposed in a big way, because it already is, and people are becoming more aware, and there is a big shift happening. And the crappy thing that I think is going to happen is that like there's a decent group of people within the horse world that are just going to stubbornly cling to what they want to believe, because they cannot cope with the discomfort of having to accept that so much of what they've believed is problematic and harmful to the horses. And then when things do start to get forced, they're going to blame all of the welfare advocates who've been trying to push for meaningful change for years, when a more abrupt and harsh change is imposed. They're going to blame people like me and like others like me that are posting about stuff like this. And they're going to blame organizations like PETA, which is more justifiable because they are an extremist organization. But they're going to make it out to be the welfare, quote unquote, extremists that are the problem instead of their inaction and their lack of self-reflection and lack of personal growth, because they're committed to blaming anyone but themselves. And this is, again, a mindset that we see far outside of the horse world, where it's people who don't want to have to deal with the discomfort of like unpacking the greater aspects of like what their participation in certain belief systems or what their apathy says. And they don't want to actually have to unpack how it harms other people. They just want to continue going about their existence and getting to do whatever they want and prioritizing their own beliefs and living pretty selfishly, as all things are considered, and not have to reflect on what it actually does to other people. And they want to victimize themselves when they are exposed to like what they support and what they do and what their actions actually mean and how it harms other people and other beings. They don't want to have to deal with that. And they want to constantly be the victim, and they want to make it out to be where they're enabled in doing so without judgment and without it changing how people feel about them. But this is the thing, is it's like what you support and what you openly encourage, either by like verbal open support or the support of your actions, or even just the support of your apathy and your lack of action, it does say something about you. And I think people do have the right to judge you based off of that and decide how comfortable they feel around you as a person, because they know that you're not going to stand up for them and protect them. And it goes within the horse world, it goes outside of the horse world, but it's like ultimately like your commitment to standing up for your ethics, your commitment to self-reflecting and looking at like how your actions actually impact other people and animals and the beings that you love, like your commitment to doing so, and just like that level of self-awareness and like looking at like how the world could shift for the better and what changes could be positive. It does say something about you, because it is easier to be apathetic and to deny all of that and to just like go into this kind of like robotic, like just like gliding through life type of state where you aren't thinking deeper, because then you're not having to deal with the discomfort of doing so, but also like you miss out on a lot of important lessons and growth and ways where you could achieve a higher level of fulfillment and happiness if you did feel those things. So we need to reflect on like our actions. And this has kind of like been all over the place in terms of topic wise, but basically the core of this is that people just need to honestly start to look at like what your decision making and what your actions are actually saying about your priorities. Because a lot of times people are a lot less helpless than they think that they are. They could make better decisions for their horses. They could find better solutions. But it involves the discomfort of having to make those plans, having to think through and accept the impact that certain care practices are having on your horse or certain decisions are having on your horse, and then having to kind of reroute and make a new plan. And that sucks. And there are going to be long periods during that where you really don't know where you're headed or where you're going. And it can be unknown and it can be scary and it can be chaotic. And it's not always fun, but like life isn't here to always be fun. And like being uncomfortable about something doesn't mean that it's the wrong decision. It doesn't mean that you aren't meant to learn that lesson. Sometimes things are uncomfortable because you should be uncomfortable with the way that things are. And rather than ignoring that discomfort and trying to push it down and just like deny it so that you can accept the way things are, becoming aware that there are things that are just unjust and that aren't okay and that do need resolving, that awareness can help make positive change. And if more people were willing to do that, the world would be created in a way where it's going to serve more people and it's going to more closely meet the needs of people and animals worldwide, and where we can make things more fair. But a lot of people don't want to have to handle the discomfort associated with doing that, because it does suck. So anyways, like if you're putting yourself in discomfort to learn new things and to become more aware of the problems in the world and like what contributes to them and just like the degree of corruption and things, like good for you. That's a really courageous act, because it is scary. It does suck. It can be really demoralizing and discouraging, but also the more people who are willing to do that and be like, wait, I don't want to accept this. We could do things better. The more chance we have of changing things for the better. So I encourage everyone to do that, because also speaking it out loud, speaking it into existence gives other people the courage to do the same. Because a lot of times these people who are in a state of apathy, who aren't talking about these things, or who are in denial, they have felt internally that there's something off, and they haven't been totally okay with things. And there's been parts of them that haven't been fully buying into or accepting the things that they outwardly might come across as accepting. And they've just been waiting for someone to validate that, because in their inner circles, no one has, and they don't want to be the outlier. They don't want to be the odd one out. They don't want to feel like they are going to get pushed out of their group of peers that has accepted them so far. So they need other people to do it first, so that they can have the courage to do that for themselves and realize that they aren't the only one who feels that way, and that they aren't a freak, or that they aren't the one that's being weird or the odd one out, you know? And that's really all it is. So it just all starts with the courage to just talk about the changes you'd like to see, and like the problems that you see in the world. And it's not being negative. It's talking about reality and ways to change it, because also it's like, we shouldn't be so fixated on being so toxically positive that we're not going to look at the problems that are present in the world and how they could be fixed. Like, I think it's a greater degree of negativity to perpetuate normals that are harmful when we could be changing them. Like, the act of wanting to change things for the better is a positive act, and we could be doing better. So you're not being negative by speaking that into existence just because other people are so clinging to their comfort that they don't want to have to honestly look at the world around them and open their eyes. So don't let people shame you into doing that. And anyways, thank you for listening to this podcast, everybody. Let me know your thoughts. As always, if you have any like podcast episode suggestions, send them in. Also, I'm trying to start doing a new bit on some of the podcasts once I get enough stories, where I'm going to do like listener stories, and they can be like about a variety of things. It can be like funny stories, like valuable lessons that you've learned, just something you want to get off your chest, like situations you've gone through. Like, honestly, anything goes, horse related or not. And if you have a story that you would like to share, send it to makingmilestonespodcast@gmail.com. And honestly, anything goes. If you're not sure that if I would like the story, just send it in anyways, because I would just love to read them. And I think that sending in those types of stories would be things where it could help resonate with other people who've been in similar situations, and can help them get the courage to make decisions that they need to, or to realize that their feelings about certain things have been right, and that they haven't been the freak or the outlier in this situation, and just like help provide people with more context of like, hey, other people do go through similar things as me, or just provide like comedic relief on a day where they need it, or anything like that, you know? So please send in your stories if you're interested. Also, I have a 40% off store-wide Black Friday sale going on in my online store, and that's like 40% off store-wide, including clearance items. So there's like really, really low prices. This is the biggest sale I've ever had. It's the biggest sale of the year. It will not happen again until next year. So I highly recommend checking that out, because the sale ends on November 30th. So you want to get your orders in before then if you want to shop the deals. I've also done a preliminary release of 2 new bridle styles, one of which is flat, like plain leather, like English style bridle, but with no noseband, because that was requested by a bunch of people. So that's been released for just in time for the Black Friday sale. Really, really limited quantities in this preliminary release. And then the second bridle is a hybrid between my anatomical bitless bridle, the Milo bridle, and the anatomical bitted bridle, the Harlow bridle. So you can ride it in it bitted or bitless, or both, and use 2 sets of reins, which is personally for me, when I'm starting horses under saddle, I'll start them bitless, and I'll do the 2 reins thing to get them introduced to bitted riding, or vice versa. If you're trying to teach a horse who's been ridden predominantly bitted how to go bitless and you're nervous about it, that's another great way to go about it. Again, really limited quantities for the preliminary release. They will not be discounted to this extent again until next Black Friday. So if you want to try one, get in on the sale now, and you can do that at shopmilestoneeq.com. I'll put the links down below in the podcast description as well. And then also on my main website, where I have my training, webinars, and whatnot, All of the webinar recordings are 60% off with code BLACK at checkout, and that's on milestoneequestrian.ca. And those are the learning webinars on a variety different of training topics, such as like intros to positive reinforcement, what Lima training principles are, fear behavior in horses, stress behavior in horses, intro to horse behavior, trailer loading, and more. 60% off until November 30th with code BLACK at checkout. On my online store for the products, the discount code will be automatically applied at checkout. So you won't see it when you go to the store, but when you add the products to your cart and go to checkout, the 40% off discount will be automatically applied. But for the training webinars, you do have to punch in the code. So anyways, thank you for that. I appreciate all of your support. It's been allowing me to keep doing what I'm doing, and I have some really exciting things in the works. So I'm really appreciative of everyone who listens to this podcast and like supports me in any way, if it's shopping at my store, listening to the podcast, sharing my videos, commenting on my Instagram posts, subscribing to Patreon or anything like that. It's so appreciated. So for anyone interested in Patreon as well, I'm having like 50% off of your first month of Patreon subscriptions with code BLACK at like the Patreon checkout as well. And you can subscribe for like as little as $1 a month. However, the 50% off code is for subscriptions of $5 a month or more. And you can subscribe to Patreon, and there's like a full library of like training videos that you can look at. We do monthly Q&As. There's also patron-only podcasts that are being released. I've also done a recent thing where we're starting to talk about studies and like debunking studies, talking about different types of horse studies, and me just going through that information, which is great for people who don't have access to like the scholarly articles, because I do have a bunch of studies saved that I can break down and talk to people about and just give that information out to give people more context. And I also take requests for topics that you want to see that done with. So Patreon's a really great way to help support my work, and it is greatly appreciated for anyone who does that, because everything helps, and it just helps me continue doing the work that I'm doing. And also Patreons get like, they're the first ones to know about like sales and stuff, and also they're going to be the first ones to know about my book release when that happens, because we're coming up to the deadline where I'm going to submit my manuscript, so stuff is starting to get real. So I'm going to have some exciting stuff about that going on in the new year and whatnot. But anyways, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to check out all that stuff. Don't miss out on the sales, because these are the biggest sales I've ever had, and it's a Black Friday only thing. Great time to get Christmas gifts, treat yourself, get your friends gifts, do whatever you need to do. Just a great time to try out any of that stuff if you've been interested in it, because you'll get the biggest discount of the year. But anyways, thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you again next week, everybody. Have a great day, and I hope everyone's doing well. So see you later. Thank you so much for tuning into the Making Milestones podcast this week. If you are interested in ways that you can help support the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help to promote the podcast in the algorithm, allowing me to connect with new listeners, and it is so greatly appreciated. Some other ways you can help to support the podcast include subscribing to my Patreon channel, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and access monthly Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. Every subscription helps, and they help to offset any costs associated with the podcast, allowing me to keep most of these episodes ad-free. I also have an online store where I sell equestrian athletic apparel, graphic t-shirt and hoodie designs, horse bridles, both bitted and bitless, and you can check that out in the podcast description as well. Lastly, I have my main website where I have a bunch of webinars with different types of training topics, and where I also offer online training consultations if you want a one-on-one appointment with me. All of this helps me continue doing what I'm doing, and your support is so appreciated.